The content herein is for informational purposes only, not intended as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and is not to be substituted for direct advice from your doctor.
Today's LymphCast program is proudly sponsored by VitaSupport MD, the makers of Vein Formula 1000 and Lymphatic Formula 1000. These MPFF-based nutraceuticals are backed by science and recommended by doctors specializing in venous and lymphatic disorders. Visit VitaSupportMD.com to learn more.
Welcome to LymphCast, the show that brings together doctors, other health professionals, and special guests to discuss lymphedema, venous disease, and other associated disorders, and what can be done if this is affecting your life. Now it's time to sit back, relax, as it's time to learn all about lymphedema, venous disease, and associated disorders on our show, LymphCast. Welcome to the LymphCast show. This is episode number 4. Let's meet our panel right away. The gentleman who put everything together for this show and had the big idea about the show to begin with. From New Jersey, physician surgeon John A. Chuback. Greetings, Dr. Chuback. How are you today?
Doing fine, Paul. Thanks so much. Good to see you as always, and really looking forward to today's show. Not only do we have a spectacular guest, but we have one of our very preeminent LymphCast hosts with us today, perhaps, if memory serves, for the first time for a full episode. So very, very happy to have Dr. Mark Melin here, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot and sharing what I can, but I plan to learn a lot today on today's episode for sure.
All right, sounds good. Let me introduce Dr. Mark Melin. Dr. Mark Melin, give us a little bit of your background, what you've done, as we said in the previous episode to the other physicians, what you've done until from birth until now to get to this point in life. And then I'll have you bring our special guest in that you brought along, a therapist in lymphedema. So let me start with you, Dr. Mark Melin from Minnesota. Take it from there, sir.
Thank you, Paul. And, John, it's always a privilege to be with you. And it's a brilliant idea that you had starting this. So thank you for your leadership and really your commitment to educating our colleagues on lymphedema. So I'm in Minneapolis. I'm medical director of the Wound Healing Institute, part of mHealth Fairview, which is part of the University of Minnesota system. We love dealing with wounds. The bigger the wound, the more excited we get, just because it's such great opportunities to participate in restoration of health and getting people back into their daily activities. So I've been doing wound care for a long time, did vascular surgery for about 20 years. And I've been happily married for 33 years to my wife, Cindy. We have 4 grown children, 3 rescue dogs. And I want to introduce Brandy with a comment of, we were talking pre-show about some of our best friends. And I just made the offhanded comment that some of our best friends are lymphangions. And I can't think of a better way to introduce Brandy than to say that when it comes to education in the United States, when it comes to wound care, when it comes to really helping to educate our colleagues and improve the standard of care, Brandy and ILWTI are a significant part of this. I know many of the educators that participate with her in this nationwide effort, as well as international effort. So really with that, Brandy, I just want to open it up to you. Tell us what ILWTI stands for. Give us your background, and we're just excited to hear you educate.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate you and Dr. Chuback for inviting me today. It's definitely an honor to be on this LymphCast with you gentlemen. So ILWTI is International Lymphedema and Wound Training Institute. So yes, we are international. We train definitely a lot of therapists, physicians, nurses in the United States, Canada, and internationally. Our last class had a student from Hong Kong, had one from Trinidad and Tobago, and actually had 2 from Trinidad and Tobago. And then our upcoming course has a few from Canada as well. So we absolutely have an amazing time training throughout the world. It's been quite a ride for the last couple of years that I've been CEO at ILWTI. But before I was CEO at ILWTI, I started as a occupational therapist 22 years ago. And then about a year into my career as an OT, I realized I didn't want to do just regular OT anymore. And I convinced an oncologist and some coworkers and cohorts of mine that maybe we needed to get lymphedema certified. And everybody looked at me like I was the redheaded stepchild who, I mean, it couldn't have been any weirder, right? Why would anybody want to do that? And what in the heck is it? So I go and I get lymphedema certified by DeCourcy Squire way back in the day, right? DeCourcy was one of the premier trainers of lymphedema therapists, especially in the state of Georgia, where I'm located. I'm actually in South Georgia. And the rest is really history. I started a little program in our local hospital, and shortly thereafter took that to an outpatient basis. We have a couple of satellite clinics around now, but over the years, I realized something that I not only could I train therapists to work with me, right? But then I could help other people to start lymphedema clinics and start lymphedema programs. And all of a sudden, because I was also a business owner and a therapist who had the billing knowledge, the coding knowledge, all of that part of it, I knew exactly what Medicare wanted. I knew what they didn't want, right? I'd been audited enough times to go on both ends of that spectrum. And all of a sudden, I realized I had a knowledge base. And so I started reaching out to vascular surgeons and other therapists and anyone I could come in contact with, because at that point, my radius for treatment was running about 2.5 hours in a radius circle around myself in South Georgia, 2.5 hours to get to therapy. So all of a sudden you have a really wide range of physicians who are ordering your services and requiring more of your services. And so you get to teach more, and you get to teach physicians, you get to teach other therapists, you get to teach patients, you get to teach family members, and things started to grow exponentially. And so that actually is how I came upon the original founder of ILWTI, who is Robin Bjork. Robin and I started, we kind of ended up in the same circles, conventions and things like that. And then all of a sudden, Robin and I realized that she had a great handle on the training institute piece of it, but I also had a really good handle on being able to train other therapists how to actually put that into place, right? Because you can have all the best training in the world, but if you don't know how to actually implement that program and get that program off its feet and going, and how to make it financially stable, you're not going to have a program. So that's been my mission over the last several years. I'd say probably 10, 15 years of my career has been based off of assisting other people to be able to create these programs, be able to get lymphedema programs that are up and substantial and financially in the green, no more red. So that's kind of where ILWTI came into place. And then when Robin decided she was going to retire, it was a perfect fit for us to come in and take over that training program, because we had the full spectrum then. So not only am I exceptionally blessed to have an amazing crew of directors with us at ILWTI, I have Dr. Susie Eman, who is our Director of Compression Specialist. I have Dr. Heather Hetrick, who is our Wound Care Coordinator and Director. I have Monika Carson, who is our Modern MLD Director. And I have Lisa Marshall, who is our Oncology Director. These are all exceptional women in our field who go above and beyond. So much research, so much heartfelt training goes in with these directors. They're cutting edge. They're the top of the top. We don't let anything get by us. I tell people all the time, back in when we all first started doing lymphedema, you learned it one way. That's all that you got. That was it. Well, now we changed everything a few years back, and we don't do massive updates for lymphedema training anymore. We update as we go. As a matter of fact, we don't even print anything anymore at ILWTI because all of our students have what we call access to our alumni portal. That alumni portal is updated almost every single class with the latest and greatest information. So when our students access information from ILWTI, right, it's not something that was printed 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This information is current. It's the now. And that's how we want to stay at ILWTI. We don't want to be teaching that old stuff. We don't want to, what? You don't know about the EGL? You don't know about the endothelial glycocalyx layer? Isn't that fabulous, Mark? Right?
No, so Brandy, the passion is palpable. I know many of your co-directors, and they are on the leading edge, but they're also they're based in a passion to improve outcomes for our patients. And one thing that you said that I think is so critical for people to hear is this radial growth. But radial growth occurs, I think, because physicians like John and I see the interaction with our patients and see improvement in outcomes that we cannot achieve with straightaway vein ablations in the C3, C4, C5, C6 patients. And the interactions are so positive that patients may go in a little bit like, is this going to make a benefit? But it turns into such phenomenal relationships that it's really a building upon, I think you treat not only body, but I think you treat heart and soul as well. And I think that's why these outcomes are so phenomenal.
I definitely agree. You know, the interaction we have with our patients is top notch. You want to have, they've got to have confidence in you. The physicians have to have confidence in you. You have to be very proficient with your skills. When our students come out of our training programs, not only do we send them out, but then we give them support, right? They run into problems. We are right there to back them up the entire time so that they can have those amazing outcomes, just like I see at my clinic, right? Yes, I have 22 years of experience, but I love to say that our students can come out and have 2 years of experience and still have some amazing outcomes, get some amazing referral back off of those outcomes, right? So we see that turnaround in patients. And, you know, I've got a wonderful story about a young lady in Murray, Kentucky. Murray, Kentucky is just a little rural town in Kentucky, right? Well, back in 2021, I started helping this young lady. She had just finished our program via teletraining, the first teletraining course that ILWTI had ever had. And she decided she wanted her own program, wanted her own clinic, right? So we decided we were going to build her all the way from the ground up. That young lady last month sent her first physical therapy assistant to join her. And she's already on about a month backlog. She's got more patients than she knows what to do with. And she is in the middle of Timbuktu, right? But she has had those wonderful outcomes. She has that rapport with her patients. Her patients love her, all right? The physicians that are working with her find that they can reach out to her for those patients they can't get those great results with, right? Because we're there to make the physicians look good just like they make us look good, right? We need that cohort in order to make everything work like it's supposed to work. And so all of a sudden you see these therapists that are in these rural areas that are in maybe not so rural areas who are really getting these amazing outcomes. They're not only getting wonderful reductions in lymphedema, but they're getting fabulous wound healing, wounds that wouldn't heal, wounds that were 2-3 years old that no one could get to heal. And all of a sudden you add a little MLD, you add some compression, a little exercise, and a little TLC, and guess what you get? Some really, really nice results. So,
Two questions. I'm going to have you actually do more of a detailed approach, like John or I send you a patient, because we've struggled to get, let's just say, a wounded patient, a C6, a venous leg ulcer patient healed. We've put the patient on, we've done what we think is standard of care compression. We've started a diosmin, micronized purified flavonoid fraction. We've treated all the other stuff, and we just can't get the edema reduced. So I'm going to have you a little bit more detail. What is it that your approach and specifically you're doing, time frames for outcomes, and then ultimately, how do you expand that to get into some of these lymphedema deserts where patients are really suffering?
So, when a patient comes into my office and I evaluate them, we do look at how long that patient's already been treated, how long they've been in wound care. If they've been in wound care and never been seen a vascular surgeon, that's my first referral, right? I'm going to make sure that my patients are seen by whom they need to be seen by so that we can get that best outcome. So then we're going to evaluate, going to check those wounds, make sure that everything looks good with that wound. Maybe the wound base looks good. Maybe the peri-wound skin's not real good. But what we know is that the more edematous, the more fibrotic that tissue is that surrounds that wound, the harder it is to heal, right? So we know that the immune response system, when there is significant amounts of lymphedema in an area, is just minimal, right? You just don't get any good flow. That you're not getting those antibodies down. Everything's just stagnant. And 9 times out of 10, that patient feels pretty cruddy. Okay. So we bring those patients in. We do manual lymphatic drainage. We open all the way from the trunk and then work our way down to that extremity where that wound is, draining everything around that wound all the way back up, making sure that patient's drinking plenty of water to flush those toxins right on out of that body. Okay. Making sure that diet is good. Mark and I were talking earlier about that low sodium diet being extremely, extremely necessary to get really good reductions with these patients and keep them off of that lymph refill roller coaster that we often see with our patients. We do multi-layer compression bandaging. It can be multi-layer. It can be 2-layer, 4-layer. Okay. But making sure that we are compressing as far up as we need to, right? So what we see a lot of is that we still get a lot of these patients who've been in Una boots for a while, right? We see a lot of these patients who've been in 2-layer systems for a while. And so sometimes those wound care clinics have left those patients in those for weeks, right? It looked great when we took it off. And then we took it off and we did nothing to it from that point on. So let me tell you what happens then. Then we need more compression garments, right? So we've got to know what our long-term plan is with those patients. So we decongest the leg. We get some really nice compression on it because the gold standard for wound healing is compression. All right. We get compression on that leg, good steady compression. And then starting from day number 1, we start thinking about what compression we're going to need to maintain that patient. Are we going to need a flat neck garment? Are we going to need something custom? Are we going to be able to go off the shelf? We're going to make sure that we were discussing with that patient so that those financial limitations are known right from the upfront. If we need to get that patient financial help from somewhere else, let's go ahead and get that going from day number 1 so that we know what we need to do to make sure that our long-term outcome, because you take an Una boot off, you take a multi-layer system off and you don't put anything on and it comes right back, right? That's what happens. So
because you can obtain that reduction, but this upstream thinking or upstream mentality then results in maintenance that also then ultimately decreases the recidivism rates.
Exactly. So the more that we can maintain, right? So I had patients who down the road don't have to wear the compression all the time. Absolutely. Yes, I have. Okay. I would say that the majority of our patients do need compression at some degree long-term, right? For a chronic condition. However, I have seen those conditions, especially when we're dealing with those phlebo lymphedema patients who have some significant wounds. And all of a sudden we get the wounds healed. We get vascular to come in and help us with that flow, right? And then we get everything decongested. We keep everything decongested for 6 months, a year. And then all of a sudden, wow, I see that patient at Walmart and they don't even have their stockings on and they look pretty darn good. So it's amazing what can happen.
So John, I'm going to bring you in for a question, just because when we talk about the patients with a venous ulcer that have significant associated lymphedema, connecting vein centers and wound clinics and certified lymphedema therapists to maximize outcomes is important. John, where do you see the right time to intervene on, say somebody needs great saphenous vein and anterior saphenous vein ablations and they've got a wound? Where do you see the role in terms of ablation in working with Brandy and CLTs to get the best, earliest closure outcomes?
Generally speaking, I think earlier is better. Generally, I think it's the sooner you can get the patient on the schedule for endovenous ablation, ultrasound guided sclerotherapy, phlebectomy, et cetera, to do everything you can to eradicate venous stasis, venous reflux, and venous hypertension, the better. There is a caveat to that, though, and I know that, Mark, you've seen patients like this too. There are some patients who may be morbidly obese, and the edema is so pronounced, so overwhelming, so dramatic that it can be a bit intimidating for even a very experienced surgeon to want to dive right in and start getting engaged in ablations and interventions for fear of having unnecessary complications like deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism being at the forefront of your mind when you see a very large patient, heavy patient, poor mobility, limited ambulation. Those are the patients where I like to get them more into the hands of a therapist and really work on mechanically decompressing those limb or limbs, to get some of that edema out and get some more mobility in the patient, more activity, the calf muscle pump working, et cetera, getting them, as you said, on dietary supplementation with bioflavonoid, MPFF, cleaning up the wounds, sharp debridement, wound care, et cetera. But I would say, in my experience of almost 20 years in treating those kinds of patients, I would say they're in maybe a 2 to 5% of the overall population that I really sort of kind of pump the brakes a little bit and say, I think we need to kind of tune this patient up before surgery. Generally, I think surgery intervention, procedures should come right out of the gate along with everything else. I don't hold off on anything else. It's happening contemporaneously with all of the supportive physical measures, compression, hands-on therapy, et cetera, dietary changes, psychosocial, emotional support, everything that we can do for that patient. But there is a small subset that I, at least personally, I don't know that that's necessarily a gold standard or that everyone would agree, but there is a small subset, particularly in the morbidly obese population with severe lymphedema related to phlebital lymphedema, where I will kind of hold off and let that patient cool down a little bit, especially if there's significant cellulitis, et cetera. Kind of the lesson we learned in cardiac surgery, where not every patient had to go rushing to the OR for revascularization after acute MI. We found that some of those patients do better cooling them off for 5 to 7 days, as long as they're stable and can tolerate that. So there's some comparison there, but that's how I would answer that question for you. I'd like to hear what you think, how you feel about that.
Today's LymphCast program is proudly sponsored by Vita Support MD, the makers of Vein Formula 1000 and Lymphatic Formula 1000. These MPFF-based nutraceuticals are backed by science and recommended by doctors specializing in venous and lymphatic disorders. Visit vitasupportmd.com to learn more.
And I think, as you and I have listened to Brandy's passion and her educational, what she's achieved, it's exactly that patient population that I think is such a challenge to get good outcomes in. And this again calls back to how Brandy and her team can really help in these patients. So kind of that prehabbing component, and addresses all those things. And John, you and I have had discussions before just about the number of these patients that deal with frank depression. And I also think that Brandy and her team offers a huge component of that psychosocial. And John, you're such an advocate for that, of helping those patients do better, because we know that they're all going to have better outcomes if you do literally go from head to toe. And Brandy, you've been addressing exactly this group that John so wisely brings up.
You know, these patients, there's such a psychosocial element with all of them, right? From the fact that they're unhealthy, right? They're obese. They don't think there's anything that's really going to help them. You know, a lot of these patients are so obese and they have such horrible lymphedema and wounds that they can't even see a light at the end of the tunnel to ever be healthy, right? So showing them and guiding them through that whole process, because they're those patients who have frequent bouts with cellulitis. Those are the patients that, you know, at first we are doing everything we can just to decongest that a little bit, to even get some knee flexion, to get some ankle flexion, right? To even start to talk about an exercise program. But then you're right, all of a sudden things start to mobilize, and the lymphatic fluid starts to go away and the wounds start to heal. And all of a sudden this patient, not only can they move better, but all of a sudden you see them with a smile on their face when they walk in the door. Well, then all of a sudden, then you can start to talk about diet a little bit more. Then you can send them back to that physician. Maybe we need some supplementation to be able to assist with that a little bit more. And then next steps, definitely, once you get that decongested more, get those wounds, maybe not even all the way healed. And maybe, you know, we're down to the, you know, we know that that wound needs to heal, but we need help at this point. And that's when we go back into that vascular surgeon. We've got to have that help to get this last part of it down. Or you've got those patients that will not quit refilling, right? Same thing. I'm sending them back to the vascular surgeon. Let's find out what's going on there, because there's something else.
And one of the things that I would jump in there too and add, I think I agree with all of it. And Mark and I have talked a lot about this. This has been a passion of mine for many years, is the idea that, and we're having this discussion, and we've created this program to raise awareness for patients as well as physicians, and they're continue. And this is not a criticism of either. There's just so much to know in contemporary medicine. But one of the things that continues to escape many physicians is that the obese and morbidly obese patient is often malnourished. They're often overfed and undernourished, and often, obviously, lacking mobility and exercise. But when you talked earlier, the two of you, about sodium, the role that sodium plays, couldn't agree more. But also, let's keep in mind protein malnutrition that many of these patients have, leading to third spacing of fluid, and that dietary changes are essential. And something that Mark and I have talked a lot about in wound healing is not only the role of micronized flavonoid, MPFF, but also the many other micronutrients and vitamins necessary for wound healing that many of these obese patients and morbidly obese patients are dreadfully low in, if one were to check those levels. So things like A and D and E and K, and zinc and C and D, and it goes on and on and on. And not only do you see it in terms of third spacing of fluid and fluid retention and gross edema, but also, as Brandy touched on, in terms of these, chronically refilling patients and the cellulitis patients, et cetera, has a massive impact on the immune system and immunological function. So not only the physical hydrostatic pressure problem and venous hypertensive pressure problem on the skin causing the physical disturbance of the mechanism of immunology, but also a dietary and nutritionally based immunological embarrassment. So there's so many components to this. And I'm so pleased we're having the conversation, because again, it's not a criticism of our colleagues, but so many of our colleagues have absolutely no idea what we're talking about. And that's what we're trying to shed light on. So I thank you both again for participating.
Well, and John, one of the words you and I have used, with all due respect, is intimidating. And I think that some of these topics are incredibly intimidating. And I'll be the first guy to admit out of the box, I've carried a level of arrogance for a long time in my practice. And I would run into a certified lymphedema therapist who's just brilliant, like Brandy. And I'm just looking at it basically as a signature so I can move the piece of paper, not totally understanding what Brandy was actually doing in the totality of her care to the patient that I was trying to serve as best I could. So I think somehow, John, you and I can helping to lead the way in terms of dropping that level of arrogance, recognizing the intimidation factor of what lymphedema is, what the microvasculature is, nutrients, and just realizing how critical this is to what we're really trying to accomplish at the end of the day. And, Brandy, you've gone through this really beautiful checklist manifesto of what we need to achieve and what you're doing on a regular basis with your patients, because within some degree of flexibility, but there are certain really critical components of that have to be done with every patient. And you've done a phenomenal job of outlining that. I want to just pivot a little bit, because I want to focus on this international component, because the work that you guys have done internationally, I actually think can boomerang back into what we see as literally some third world conditions in the United States. So talk to us about like podioconus and the red clay and how that impacts filarial disease, and then how we can take some of those lessons that you've learned from international management and how we can start to treat some of our communities.
So, what we've learned from the international realm, right, in those third world countries and those really severe chronic cases of lymphedema from podioconus and filariasis and things like that, is that we realize that when you start to add basic hand techniques, such as manual lymphatic drainage, right? Takes 2 hands. That's it. They don't cost a lot, right? And then we start to add some compression to those patients. We start some skincare with those patients. We start some exercise with those patients. And all of a sudden, we can get some really wonderful results with very little supplies. Okay, so when we're talking about the international realm, we have to think on a very low supply chain, right? We don't have all of the things, all of the wonderful wound care products and the wonderful compression products that we have here in the United States that we have in a lot of those third world countries. But let's stop and think about a lot of those patients that we see in those clinics. That's our low income population, right? So let's really stop and think about the basics. You've got to have the basics in order to get those patients. And you know what I found is that sometimes it's my primary care physician who finally convinced that patient to walk into my office, but they still have never been seen by wound care physicians, by vascular surgeons, by anyone. But my primary job at that point in time is to earn their trust and to let them start to see some results. And then we are not in a third world country, and we do have options, and we do have wonderful premier care in the United States. And so But sometimes you're dealing with people that are almost at that third world level, right? They don't know. They don't understand. I mean, a lot of these patients that come to me with huge lobes on their legs, and you think, how in the world did this get to this point? We live in the United States. And you know what? That patient, some of the time, has never even heard of what you're about to do to them. Not to mention, they're scared to death when they walk in that clinic because they don't know what's going to happen. Most of them think I'm going to take a knife or a scalpel and start hacking on their leg, right? And what they don't know is that the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to touch them. Okay, touch is very calming for a lot of people. And so as soon as we start talking to them and then we touch them, we actually touch the extremity. We touch them and tell them exactly what we are going to do to them and how it's going to benefit them and what they're going to see. And, you know, sometimes, you know, I can see that fear in those patients' eyes. So we start talking about the financial piece. And then, you know, if I know it, that's a really low income patient. But let me tell you about some places that can help us with some of this so that their fears there again subside, because we're not going to get anywhere without it. And then you start to build that rapport with that patient, and that patient starts to come 3 times a week, right? You've got some of these patients that are coming an hour, 2 hours, sometimes depending on the severity. And you just got a connection that no one else has gotten, because although you guys are amazing and wonderful, we see those patients a lot more than you do most of the time, right? And so then we can take those patients and then we can say, and then I have a colleague over here who I think can help us with this. Will you trust me enough to let me send you there? You know, and that's how we start to take, especially in these rural areas, right? What we have found is that it seems like the more rural the areas are, the worse those conditions tend to be. Okay. I am in South Georgia. I am in the middle of nowhere. Okay. Atlanta, Georgia is 2.5 hours from me. Jacksonville, Florida is 2.5 hours from me. There was nothing in this area when I started 20 years ago. Okay. It took a long time to build up to be able to get that level of rapport, not only with the patients, with the physicians, with the surrounding therapists, with the surrounding other medical community, to be able to build all of that up. And so that's really the mission of ILWTI, is that you're right, Mark, it bases off of that international stance. You have to take those same skills and utilize them here in the United States. Right now, we've got those patients that are going to come in who have wonderful insurance and have everything at the snap of a finger, right? We can get the best of the best, but that's, you know, you might be 60, 40, 60% on the lower income, 40% on that higher, right? And that's the basics of it. The majority of my patients are still Medicare and Medicaid. They just are.
You're pointing out a lot of the real challenges that we're up against. You know, again, I'm far from a rural area. You know, a stone's throw from New York City. I see the Manhattan skyline on my ride into the office every morning, and we're surrounded by many urban areas where there is a lot of poverty. And as you said, generally speaking, obviously, we're not trying not to generalize, but the most severe cases I see in my area are coming out of the inner city. And in those situations, we don't have only access to insurance, for example, and financial circumstances that can help with out-of-pocket expenses for these kinds of therapies, bandaging, hands-on therapy, et cetera, but also a major piece of the puzzle becomes transportation, going from physician to physician, especially with the heavier patients and those patients with tremendous lymphedema, travel, transportation, mobility. All of these things create additional challenges. And that's why I give you so much credit for what you're doing. But as we try to build a community in each of our geographical communities between surgeons, wound care specialists, who may or may not be surgeons, vascular surgeons, who may or may not be venous specialists, therapists for hands-on and decongestive treatments and wrapping and so forth. This multimodality sort of approach and milieu that we're almost fantasizing about and in some ways creating, and we are a part of and we are supporting, can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for so many of these patients. And that's one of the challenges that we have to deal with. And from the physician's point of view, again, and from the therapist's point of view, I think the big word is compassion. We really have to be compassionate. You really have to care about patients. I had a professor in Rochester who used to say, when you know how to use a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. So we've gotten to a point, unfortunately, where when you know how to burn a saphenous vein, the whole world looks like a big leaky saphenous vein. When you know how to wrap a leg, it looks like a leg that needs to be wrapped. When you know, and on and on and on. So each of us is kind of attending to our piece of the puzzle very well, but after you've closed all the veins you think can be closed, and the leg is still swollen, and the patient is still suffering, and the patient is still edematous and lacks mobility, that's where compassion comes in. And you have to say to yourself as a physician, in our case, or me and Mark, especially as a surgeon, what else can I do for this patient? Where else can I send them? How can I get them there? And this is where the Herculean effort starts to come in for those of us. We're all busy, we're successful, you've got so much on your plate already. And each one of these patients becomes sort of a clinical tour de force to really get them plugged into the system at every level in terms of all of this care that they need, how to support that financially, how to access reimbursement, how to deal with transportation, how to deal with education. But I'll tell you, one of the things that you said that resonates with me, when I was up in Rochester training in open heart, one of the things that was mandatory on rounds by my old chairman, Jeff Hicks, was every patient needed to be touched. After an open heart, before an open heart, you had to hold their hand in your hand and make that human connection. And that's what I fear we're losing too much of in contemporary medicine as we go more to electronic medical records and remote care and Zoom calls and so on. I understand the value in it, and I certainly appreciate technology. But if we don't hold on to that piece, then the whole system is really doomed, and medicine won't be what it is, healthcare won't be what it is, the care won't be what it should be, and the patient and the practitioner both will suffer. But this is such a challenge. I mean, that's why I created the program, quite frankly, because it is such a massive, massive problem. And I hope we can find some of these answers together, how to bridge so many of these chasms that exist in getting these patients to where they need to be clinically.
Vein Formula 1000 and Lymphatic Formula 1000 from Vita Support MD are backed by science and sold in doctors' offices. If you're a physician who may be interested in prescribing or selling these excellent nutraceuticals, please call 862-246-7877 to speak to a representative today.
Well, John, the beauty of this podcast is taking down silos, right? I mean, the fact that you and I get to spend a full hour with Brandy, I think just says a lot about your wisdom in trying to accomplish this. Because if we can't start to get vein centers of excellence like yours together with lymphedema therapy centers of excellence, especially educators like Brandy, with vascular labs, because we haven't even talked yet about diabetes, making sure everybody's got an ABI that's got a wound. And then how do we bring on our vascular
wound care centers like your own.
And wound care centers. I mean, it's kind of like
nutritionists and psychologists. I mean, it's a big deal. Dietitians, physical therapists. who are doing, not just the MLD and so forth, but, Brandy refers to patients that don't have any mobility in their knee. They don't have any flexion. They don't have, they don't have any range of motion. They don't have any strength. Under that gigantic limb is a paper thin layer of musculature that can't even lift and support this body in so many instances. I mean, this makes a triple bypass look easy. I mean, it really does. You have a few blockages, throw a few vein grafts there and a mammary artery beyond the stenosis, and you get a ventricle that's banging away and you're all set. This makes that stuff, to your point, Mark, and we've had this conversation before, the arrogance, especially of surgeons that have dismissed the entities like this one, clinical pathological entities like this one, as being unimportant because it's, let's say, not life-threatening, at least on its face, it's not life-threatening. It's not limb-threatening, at least on its face, it's not limb-threatening, et cetera, et cetera. That arrogance needs to be re-educated and corrected.
But I actually think that, there was an interesting article in Journal of Vascular Surgery just 2 months ago that looked at the presence of advanced venous hypertensive changes in the legs, actually correlating it with increased cardiac and cerebral morbidity and mortality. And I
have
think,
no question about it.
And I think the three of us would go, well, of course, it's an incredibly inflammaging condition. But behind all of that is a disruptive lymphatic system that directly correlates with immune systemic function. So as I look at, and this is why we've talked about, instead of phlebolymphodema, started to talk about lymphedema of venous etiology, to highlight lymphedema right away, which again, where Brandy and her team have such a disproportionate impact on restoration of functionality. And I think you're touching not only the patient, but families, right? You're impacting a spouse, you're impacting kids, you're impacting grandkids by allowing these patients to start to get back into some functions of daily activity and just re-experience joy.
Absolutely. And the idea of acceptance. In other words, I know for a fact, and I'm sure Brandy will support this, when you talk about physically touching the patient, in many cases, when practitioners like ourselves reach out, especially with a bare hand, which I do routinely, and touch these patients' legs, it's the first time in many, many years that anybody has actually touched them. I mean, it really brings you back to the kind of the idea of the great old movie, The Elephant Man, and John Merrick, who was so shunned by society because of his appearance. I mean, so many times these patients are married and so forth, have been in relationships for many years, and haven't been seen without their clothes on for many years by their partner, by their spouse, or their significant other. So when we touch these patients physically, it's an emotional experience. It really is. It's an important experience, and I don't know. It's just so much here to.
Well, it's a reaffirmation. It's a reaffirmation of humanity, and I think that's really what Brandy and her team do such a great job of accomplishing from the start of the therapy through the end. And I think that's why so many patients they're sad when they graduate from your program.
We have some that don't want to graduate. They don't want to leave. They don't want to leave because, there's a big difference between making a person live, right? And then giving them quality of living. Okay. Because I've seen too many patients that are just living, right? There's no quality. There's nothing left. There's nothing left there that has any quality of life to it. And all of a sudden, we bring them in the clinic and we just give them quality of life back.
Brandy, let's go into something else, because I know we're probably getting, believe it or not, time really flies. I'm not sure how much time we have left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that what we've talked about is really important, but another really important aspect that you have touched on that we need education on. I think another reason why so many of these patients wind up neglected is because there is a perception, and I don't know how true or untrue it is, and that's what I'm looking for, is greater awareness for myself and for our audience. There's a perception that there's no financial advantage for the practitioner, the clinician, to treat these patients, that these services are not reimbursed, are very difficult to get reimbursed. The period of treatment can be very, very curtailed and shortened, if at all, that by the time you pay for your time and space and equipment and disposables and so on and so forth, you're going to be in the rears financially. So I know that you're very good at that piece. Can you address that for us and let our listeners, physicians, clinicians, therapists, et cetera, is there any hope that's false and not true?
That is very, very false. So, one of the things that a lot of therapists do not bill for is the compression bandaging, right? Because when we were originally trained, there was no coding. There was no coding for any of that, right? So all of a sudden, you've got all these therapists who are billing 97140, which is manual lymphatic drainage, right? Myofascial release. And that's a really low reimbursed code. It just is. And so when all you're billing out is that and therapeutic exercise, all of a sudden you're right. All right. It's not financially beneficial to have a lymphedema clinic on board. However, if you take these patients and you're billing appropriate, whether it's through strapping codes or Medicare just made a huge change this year, January 1, all of a sudden you could bill 29581 for bandaging of a lower extremity, whether that be a Coban 2 system, whether that be a multi-layer system, and you can do it in combination with the manual lymphatic drainage, with wound care, with debridement, with therapeutic exercise, whereas before that code never could have been used in combination with those other codes. They just released it in January. It's a game changer for any therapist. Okay.
That's really important information, because otherwise, people are under the impression, and I have to admit myself, I have been relatively under that impression over the years. It's changing now that we've been doing this program, but that it's not fiscally feasible, that it's not a feasible program, and therefore it's been kind of the thing that everybody keeps pushing along to the next guy and the next guy, and right. That patient never winds up with any care.
Exactly, because you don't want to start a program if you don't think that you can be financially stable in that program, right? Or if it's not going to have any financial benefit, or even just cut even, right? And so you take that strapping, that 29581 reimburses higher than if I were going to do 3 MLDs. It's higher than the reimbursement for that 45 minutes of MLD, and it's not timed. If it takes me 5 minutes to do that code, it doesn't matter. Do you see what I mean? So it can take me 5 or 10, 15 minutes to bandage a patient, and I'm going to get higher reimbursement from that bandaging than I am for the whole rest of my treatment, unless I'm doing wound care in there as well. And a lot of therapists forget to do that piece of it, right? Forget to bill that debridement piece of it. The reimbursement for that is double, triple sometimes what it is for that MLD. You cannot, I think that so many therapists and so many clinics get so wrapped up in, oh, I can do this and I can do it comfortably, and I'm never going to get audited this way, right? Well, you're also never going to make any money.
Is that a lymphedema therapist joke, so wrapped up?
There you go. It is. That's right. Get so wrapped up in it.
But I'm sure, like other things, especially with Medicare, as you add codes, you're getting reimbursed at, let's say, 50% of whatever your main code is. But right. Nevertheless, there's value in billing for all of the work that you have done, correct?
Right. You're right. So, there's a big difference between getting reimbursed $70 for an hour of treatment and getting reimbursed $160 for an hour of treatment.
Definitely.
Right. So there's where it's a game changer. I've taken entire clinics that were running in the red, could not make it. We're going to go under. All we do is we take and add the strapping codes. We take and add the 29581 code. And all of a sudden they're in the green. Within a month, 1 month, we can take an entire clinic and turn it around just by that one piece. That's part of what we teach at ILWTI. We teach that billing. We teach that coding. That's automatic. We don't save that for, we do have a course that's just for lymphedema and program startup. Okay. But we teach that we teach it to every one of our therapists so that they have that coding, so that they have the right things. Because what we're also finding is that, when all of those numbers go back and the government sees what we're billing, right? There's nothing that's ever going to be reimbursed at high levels if everyone keeps billing at the lowest.
Yeah.
Right.
And, just for the sake of our listeners, I always want to be clear when we talk about issues like this, financial issues, we're not talking about it from the point of view that physicians, clinicians, therapists, et cetera, are looking to profiteer in these areas. Not that each of us doesn't deserve to make a living, we do, but the reason why it's so essential is that if there is ignorance in the area of billing and reimbursement and insurance and so on and so forth, then what happens is the clinics that could be providing such services will not. They will abort such programs or never start such programs. And the person who then suffers, or the people who suffer, are the people living in that community who are suffering from those diseases, who will not have access to care. A hospital, a private clinic, a city clinic, whatever the case may be, university hospital, teaching center, cannot afford to run at a financial loss. Therapists need to be paid, physicians need to be paid, space needs to be purchased, staff needs to be supported, et cetera, et cetera. It is an expensive proposition to run any kind of healthcare facility, and therefore, if it's impossible to provide care in a way that floats the center, then the care won't be available, and the patient will suffer. And that's the point in our discussing it and bringing it up, is it's an access to care issue.
And to your point, John, if you look at a group of professionals that have always had the highest passion and integrity, I think it's a certified lymphedema therapist, because there has not been that component of anything other than we're truly trying to do the best thing for the patient at all times. And so I'm so glad you brought up this component, Brandy, and to John's really excellent point, and I hope our colleagues are hearing John loud and clear, because this, as a component within our practice, is so critical. And you have to have these associations, and you have to have really good communication with the lymphedema therapist. And this will build improved outcomes that turns into the cheapest, least expensive form of marketing you can ever have, because it's friends and families that circulate throughout your community, and that radius grows larger and larger, and that is your network.
I couldn't agree more, and highly effective form of
Right.
marketing, so to speak. When patients get better, and when people see their family members get better after suffering for many years, the joy that they experience is indescribable, quite frankly. And yes, the word in a community spreads very quickly.
Brandy, I'm going to let you summarize.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it today, guys. And, at ILWTI, every therapist that we certify to do lymphedema and wound care training, we know is going to go out and have such an amazing impact on their community. So the more therapists that we can get out in that community, the more that love spreads, the more that trust spreads, the more that we can really outreach. You know, every therapist is just one more person on this huge mission that we've got. And it is an insurmountable mission, right? But we got to do it one therapist, one patient, one referral at a time. And we can. We've got to give our therapist the absolute best. You've got to train them to be the best. You've got to train them to be those compassionate, loving therapists that are going to be able to change those patients' lives, change the medical community's lives where they are, right? Because we as lymphedema therapists, we're trainers no matter what. I was a trainer well before I ever became part of ILWTI, because that's our mission. The more that we educate, the more that we train, the more that we have wonderful Dr. Chubacks who create podcasts about lymphedema, the more effect that we're going to have internationally with lymphedema, and especially right here in the United States where we're all based out of, right? So the more therapists that we can get, you know, our teletraining has been huge. What we're finding is that we're getting much, much, much more training from our teletraining courses than we even do our live courses, right? Because we make it accessible. We make it financially accessible. We make it accessible for those people in rural areas, for those moms who can't leave their kids. We make it for those therapists who they're it, right? They can't leave that clinic. They're the only one. They can't leave for 9 days. We make it so that we can train as many people as possible with the absolute best in training, wound care, and lymphedema, and be able to spread the knowledge of lymphedema, wonderful patient care throughout as far as the regions can reach. That's our goal. Just like you guys' goals, right?
Great summary. John, any final closing words?
Just that I think it's fantastic what Brandy and her group are doing at ILWTI. And I can attest to the fact that in a major metropolitan area, theoretically the most populous metropolitan area in the United States, even at the highest level of medical care, I think the level of ignorance regarding lymphedema, lipedema, Derkham's disease, phlebo lymphedema, and all the various causes, etiologies, et cetera, is still, it's mind-boggling how little is known. And we have a lot of work to do, but I think what Brandy is doing is essential to get as many people trained in as many communities and train them to reach out to doctors, surgeons, vascular specialists, blow the bugle, sound the horn, and get all of us working together in harmony to provide the best care we can. I congratulate her, and I'm sure we'll have her back on the show when we get through this gigantic guest list. She's got a lot more to share. I know that.
I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Brandy. John, thanks for creating the platform to do this. And Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out here.
All right, now let's just summarize and thank everybody. Brandy, before we go, put out your name again, your title, the name of your business, and how people can get a hold of you. Maybe put your website, phone number, whatever you want to give people.
Yeah, so my name is Brandy Mckeown, and I am an occupational therapist and certified lymphedema and wound care specialist, also certified by LANA. And I am the CEO of ILWTI. You can reach us at www.ilwti.com. You can also reach me at Brandy Mckeown at ilwti.com. If you need any email, I will email you back as soon as we get those questions in, and we'd love to have any questions, any feedback.
Great information, and your passion just comes through the screen here, unbelievably so. So thank you on behalf of everybody, including myself. Dr. Mark Melin, thank you for getting in touch with Brandy, but also for being a valuable part of today's show.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. So thank you all for participating in today's podcast and for listening.
All right, and Dr. John A. Chuback, the originator of the show, physician surgeon from New Jersey. Thank you, sir. We'll see you next time for episode 5.
Looking forward, Paul. Thanks.